Started. Hang on. Have I started recording?
It says yes.
Okay, perfect. Avoid legal snags by telling people being recorded. You are being recorded. Okay. All right. So we are live now with Dr. Vincent Geloso. I'll just introduce you, if I may. Vincent Geloso has his PhD from the London School of Economics, one of the top institutes in the world for economics and economic history. He is an economic historian. His publications have appeared in a number of great journals, number of leading journals. In fact, the Public Choice Journal, Cliometrica, the Journal of Economic Organization and Behavior, the Canadian Journal of Economics. And he has been at various institutes. He's been at Bates College, Texas Tech. He is currently a professor of economics at King's at Western University. So he's at Western University. And a lot of his research is on economic history of various kinds. Right now, he's doing work on, I believe, state capacity. And if you could talk a little bit, because I know you're an expert on this, and I don't think this has been well studied as much as it could have. You have a book now that I don't know if it just came out. It's called Du
Oh my
Grand
God.
Rattrapage au Déclin Tranquille, right?
That's my first book. It's
Is it?
2013. Oh yeah, it's 2013 now. It's you're bringing me back. No, that was actually a book about just applying solo growth model to in a simplified form to explaining regional convergence within Canada, but with a heavy focus on the province I'm from, Quebec, in order to explain whether or not there was actual convergence and what were those episodes of convergence. And the book became a kind of an underground classic in Quebec. The economists seem to like it. The historians never liked it. And at one point, Palgrave Macmillan in 2017 asked me if I was okay with translating it and submitting it to their new series in economic history. And so it became rethinking, like an updated and revised version of that with some of the criticisms that were
Can I
made
ask
towards.
you a little bit about it? There's this myth, I guess, in Canada that the La Révolution Tranquille, the quiet revolution or the silent revolution, was a giant upsurge in activity against the established order of the Catholic Church and so on. You know, they tore down all of these institutions and became modern. And I think your book, correct me if I'm wrong, argues against this thesis, this domineering thesis in at least among Quebec historians.
Yes, and it does so on a series of grounds. So they have generally focused historians on whether or not there was a change in the way the state did things. And I thought that was an irrelevant factor because they're concentrating on inputs.
Mhm.
As an economist, inputs are interesting in as much as they tell me about production structures. But in the end, we care about inputs because they matter for outputs. So what I decided to check was there a break in convergence? Was there an acceleration in convergence? Or in any form of trend at that point in time? And what you realize is that from the 1870s to 1940, Quebec is growing, but at a much slower pace than the rest of Canada.
Hmm.
So it actually declines in relative terms. So there's actually divergence within Canada for the first, heck, 60, 80 years of Confederation. And then starting in 1945, there's a clean break that happens then, and it's a continuous convergence with literally no alteration in trend. So it's literally like you could just plot it, and it's literally the equivalent of what you would get from standard convergence modeling inside, like a very simplistic solo model from 1945 onwards. Quebec just catches up. This is the word I can never say in English. I can write it. I can't say it. It's monotiquement. I can't.
Monotonically?
Thank you. This is the word. It's just, there's some of these words you know them by heart,
Yeah.
but for some reason, and remember, I'm French Canadian, so I grew up in both languages, so I don't have a strong accent in both languages. But there's some words that I just can't cross over, and monodic that one in a monotonic sense.
Monotonously, yeah.
Yes, there it kept
Oh, wait,
increasing
hang on.
at like
It's not monotonously, it's monotonically.
Yes. So
Yes,
it's
monotonous is boring and very, dry but yeah, monotone.
monotoniquement, monotiquement. I
Monotiquement, monotiquement en français.
Yeah. So,
Uh,
but I can't say it in English for some reason.
so
So what?
just
That's
a
basically what I argued, that this
just a
convergence
question
was.
about this. No, in Quebec now, a lot of the history that I guess kids are taught in school, maybe about the Silent Revolution or La Révolution Tranquille, is that the Catholic Church was kind of in the medieval era in the way they did things. Hospitals were run inefficiently. Nuns and priests were the ones managing hospitals and schools and universities. To what extent is that true? Because that has always struck me as
It
sort of a
is.
bit of a caricature.
It is true, and it is also completely untrue, because the
Okay.
argument that the historians have concentrated is kind of the kind of argument. As an economist, I always am very skeptical. It says culture or ideology, and when as an economist I hear culture and ideology, it's not that I find them irrelevant, it's that they're they're outputs as well. Right? We invent narratives as to justify whatever set of order we see. Right? So it's basically PR. That's what ideology is down the line. Whatever justification becomes, it is a form of PR. But it is easy to explain why the church had a strong monopoly. So at the time of Confederation, there is a bargain that happens between the Catholic Church in exchange for their political support. They say here we'll support Confederation, but that means we have to team up with protectionists in Ontario, and we're going to trade our support for tariffs against a monopoly, which basically at that time was a constitutional clause that social services would fall under provincial domain, which meant that the church could actually exert some influence over the provincial government in that particular area, and could thus basically have a monopoly on the provision of services. So it was a bargain. It was
It was an
basically
informal contract, essentially.
it was log rolling. It's there's
Hmm.
actually a paper I've been writing. It's called Log Rolling for Confederation, and it's literally that. But what happened is that for a long time, the church, and there's that's a public choice explanation, and it's complemented by the economics of religion that scholars like Mark Koyama, but also Lawrence Lake Yanaconi, Rodney Stark have developed, where churches are like firms. They compete for customers, and if you give them a monopoly, they will wither away. So if they're given a monopoly over faith, you find that generally where there is a single church that's well embedded in the state, level of religious devotion are quite low, with one clear exception: when the church, even though it has a monopoly, also and gets legal support, will not wither away if it is a vehicle for a larger social conflict. And that larger conflict was between French and English Canadians. And as convergence happened in Canada and Quebec from the 1940 onwards, what you were seeing was French Canadians catching up with Anglophones, and that meant that the vehicle that the church was providing actually withered away and was losing in relevance in terms of the tensions between the two groups and the way they were fighting for political rents. Now, that vehicle was no longer a correct vehicle to use, and it withered away. And it's really easy to explain why religious devotion fell, and also why the church rapidly disengaged from the political sphere because it lost its influence in that process. But it's entirely explained by very simple economics tool, either from the literature on public choice theory or on the literature from the economics of religion. So the historians have this kind of ideological explanation, not in the sense that they're ideological, is that they're arguing a role for ideology, while I argue a much more simplistic, if you may say so, materialistic in the sense of economic theory.
Right. Um, I want to try to provoke you a little bit on this. I mean, I've basically, if you're a priest or a nun, let's say running a hospital, you're not getting paid much of a salary, are you? You're probably getting paid whatever the church is paying you, which is probably not a lot. Am I right?
Yes.
So, you could argue that I mean, to the extent that this is a relevant variable, nowadays hospitals are managed by professionals with maybe MBAs or masters in public administration. And these guys are basically rent seekers, right? So, would you rather have a priest or nun running a hospital who is maybe not so much a rent seeker, or would you rather have a perfectly self-interested guy who's running a hospital? He's a rent seeker, and in this, by talking about hospitals, we'll transition into the coronavirus.
This is where I would say I'm agnostic in a certain sense, because as a
Yeah.
public choice theorist, I see rent seeking as a prevalent feature of political and economic life. There's two questions. As soon as you've accepted that it's as prevalent, that's going to be a constant. The extent is, how big of a constant is it, and how much is it dissipated? Because the large cost from rent seeking is that there's bound to be some of it by definition. But if it's really one that can be easily, the more it's dissipated, the less growth you'll have. So we have to trade off between bad and worse in a certain sense. And it's never actually been tested formally by scholars of Quebec whether or not the arrangement that came afterwards was actually better at delivering care uh, in the most global sense than the arrangement that came before with the church. Because with the church, yes, there was some complications that came from it, but there were also advantages. It was much cheaper, meant lower taxes by a wide margin, but it also meant that there was actually a large deal of charity that was embedded inside the system. There was a lot of cases. There's a great book by, it's not well known outside of Quebec because it's not written in English. It's by Francis Guérard, who really explains very, very well the history of private care in Quebec. And there's actually one thing, and this is something that I find fascinating, is that as life expectancy was rising in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in Quebec, people before, the form that health insurance took was life insurance, in the sense that most health-related issue would lead to or that are sickness funds, in the sense that you'd have like workplace injuries. So these were the main form of insurance provided to individuals, and it makes sense when life expectancy is, say, 45 or 50. Right? It means that you're not going to consume. Most care actually happens in late days of life. So if you're not going to live to the point of physical decay where you're trying to fight it off, it makes more sense to go for life insurance. But what happens is when life expectancy starts increasing, is you start seeing the market for life insurance actually stagnate, and that there's actually lesser and smaller premiums that are contracted relative to incomes, while the market for health insurance and medical care starts expanding and expanding and expanding. So you're shifting one type of insurance for another. So there's all these factors that are coming in the history of healthcare in Quebec, and when the church was the main actor in that domain, that make me reluctant to say whether or not what came afterward was better or was it worse. There's a lot that's never been formally tested with either forms of difference, indifference, or synthetic controls, or like quasi causal mechanisms that we could test. And there is actually good setting. Like if any student is interested, Quebec is the last province that does everything in Canada. It's the last to give women to vote. It's the last to get mandatory education. It's the last to nationalize healthcare. It's the last everything. But because it's the last, you can actually do reverse synthetic control. So I have a paper I'm writing with Kevin Greer and Jamie Bologna Pavlik, where we're saying, for example, with women's vote in the U.S., there's a lot of papers that check what happened to public expenditures and the types of public expenditures that are made once women are given the right to vote, with the premise that doing so changes the median voter in a shock rapidly, so that the types of expenditures, what that particular group of voters want, changes dramatically, and politicians respond to that. But we argue backwards that if Quebec was the last place to see, we should also see the last to have its effect. So we can use the period after it gets the right to vote, where it's like everybody else, to get the effect of not giving the right to vote. It's like a kind of doing the mirror of this. And using Quebec is actually probably the best everything for testing anything in wider macro settings related to the role of institutions, that just being one example. But applying the same insights of methods like synthetic control, difference in differences, you could do it to healthcare and its history in Quebec. And any students who'd want to deal on that, it's really easy. The data's all available out there. Statistics Canada has really high quality infant mortality data, so you could get outcomes data really well. And in the Canada yearbooks, I'm literally giving people the sources now. You just Google Canada yearbooks. These are the annual statistical compendiums for Canada. There's always a section on healthcare, and it gives you public expenditures for healthcare in each provinces, number of hospitals, numbers of police insurance. There's even a price index for hospital rooms.
Wow.
So there's everything. If anyone wanted to actually like take the time to do some research on this, I mean, I would love to do it, but I only have, I already write 10 papers a year.
Very generous of you to give us the sources, though. Maybe someone
it's
out there can test these hypotheses.
I would love that. It's research is research.
Research is research. And speaking of research and hospitals and healthcare, let's turn on to the coronavirus situation. As we know, there are how many deaths now? I was reading over 700,000 cases worldwide and tens of thousands of deaths from this coronavirus situation. Bit of a shock for everybody, really. And now in Canada, everything is shut down. Probably, I don't know if you're in Quebec right now or are you in Ontario? If you're in Quebec,
I have to say this to people. This is the most important thing I have to say. I am a proud Montrealer. Montreal is Canada, and that's it.
That is debatable.
No, it's not. As an economist, I say value is subjective, with one exception. Montreal is objectively better than everything else.
And
this is my only objective statement. Toronto's bad. The rest is not interesting. Honestly, if I could make a republic out of Montreal, I would.
Well, you know what? As someone from the prairies, I will agree with you that Toronto is the armpit of Canada. So thank you.
Let's go for that. I'll take it.
The armpit of Canada is Toronto. But, Quebec, actually, it's interesting that you are in Quebec because the reporting standards for coronavirus in Quebec are very different from the rest of Canada. And Quebec seems to be doing everything very differently from the rest of Canada.
Much more aggressively, in fact.
Very much more aggressively. And in the characteristic Quebecois way, they're almost being sovereignist about their way of going about the coronavirus situation. I watched the press conferences in Quebec are very different from the rest of Canada's press conferences, much more blunt, I find, than what's going on here. I mean, much more blunt also in terms of testing. They are reporting the results from hospital tests. They don't take them to BSL-3 facilities outside of the hospital and then confirm the test. They say, we're going to present the presumptive cases as if they were cases, and they're taking a precautionary approach, it seems. What would you say? Does that seem like a good approach to you? Is Quebec doing well compared to the rest of Canada? Because it's very much a province by province issue in some way.
Yeah, here's the thing. This is where I think there's a lot of things that are moving, many moving parts. And the part that's most annoying is that, first of all, let's clarify one thing. Because of the way the Constitution is written in Canada, this is entirely a provincial matter. So everyone who's giving crap to the federal government, there isn't much that the federal government can do, with the exception of entry control. That's pretty much all the federal government can do. So now you're going to get 10 variations, well, 13 if you count the territories, 13 variations in policy making. Now, Quebec is actually very interesting in the way it's responding because it seems to test more aggressively than the other provinces. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that Quebec is increasing. So if you check from the day of the 10th case forward, and you check the trend that it has, it follows the one for Italy, which is terrifying. But I'm actually not that terrified because it's an issue of they're just testing aggressively. And South Korea also, which right now has finally leveled off. Well, it's not clear if they're fully leveled off, but they've like take the second derivative, and it's
They seem
clear
to have
that
control.
yeah, at least like at the second derivative, they've started to slow down. Uh, but for them, it's not worrying because what's happening is just they're testing aggressively. So you're going to increase the denominator of everything massively so, but it doesn't mean that it's a problematic situation. So I'm not sure what to make of this. So is it that Quebec is better at responding to people once they're infected? Or is it just better at making sure fewer people are infected or targeting them? Because the many moving pieces are we need to spot the people, we need to treat them, and we need to confine the ones who are clearly not problematic. So let's say if I got the coronavirus, I'm in the age group that's probably the least problematic. If I got it, you would probably want to stick me inside. That's one of the three things that we need to supervise at the same time. And these are all really large moving pieces that are puzzling me because we're also seeing wide variation in debt rates. We don't know exactly if it's population features. For example, why Italy has a really high debt rate. Is it because Italian institutions are poorly able to adjust to shocks in medical demand? Is it because the population's demographic features are widely different from everybody else? Widely in
So they have more
large,
people.
yes, more elderly individuals than everybody else, but also more people with comorbidity factor. So these are all like a lot of moving parts that right now, even amongst, so it's not that like, I'm not like a guy who hates experts, but here's the thing, there's individual experts in each subfield. And there is no meta expert who rises above everybody else. And in this situation, we have such divided knowledge that is so hard to aggregate and say anything of relevance that I'm actually happy that there's 13 variations in policy because you're going to have some governments try certain things and it's going to generate information for other governments in the process. And you're going to have the more variation you have in responses, the more it's going to be customized to who is being affected and the local constraints that are relevant. But you're also going to get feedback loop in terms of information for those who fail and try something else and adjusts. So right now, the thing that's like I'm not committed to any form of like, here's the answer, right? Because there's all these confounding factors, all these moving parts. But the thing I can say for sure that I can commit to is the idea that right now, the discovery process in terms of policy is as important as it's ever been. That we need to let as like to decentralize as much as possible because of that problem of knowledge that's hard to aggregate, that's hard to understand, that's so divided and so spread out. And that's not always true from one place to another. It's
Okay,
relevant.
I would offer one retort to that, though, and that is the following. I agree with you that knowledge is localized, and local people are more likely to have better information of what's happening in a local setting. The issue I have is there can be externalities, there can be spillover effects from what one province does on another province. Let's say, yes, for example, I'll just take Saskatchewan because it's where I'm from. Let's say the Saskatchewan government is really dumb. And I mean, I don't know.
I would have, each time okay, so like for people who are listening, let's be honest. I knew you were from Saskatchewan, but each time you tell me you're from Saskatchewan, I'm like, this is the only guy I know from Saskatchewan who actually talks about it.
Yeah, well, it's a great province. I think everybody should. Well, nobody should go there because we don't want people knowing that it's a hidden gem. But it is a great province. Here's the thing. Let's suppose that in Saskatchewan, they are very lackadaisical about it, right? Because they don't have many cases. They think, okay, you know what? We're just going to allow people to travel. We're going to allow this thing to spread. We're going to allow people who are symptomatic to go to Alberta to do whatever they want to do. And then in Alberta, that might generate some kind of external cost, right?
Yep.
even if Alberta itself imposes travel restrictions on Saskatchewan, it might impose those restrictions too late. And the very fact that Saskatchewan is irresponsible will strain that system, and it might require aid from other provinces, right? Or it might require aid from the federal government. So, in essence, you're creating a negative externality, negative spillovers on others. So,
Yep.
isn't there an argument for a centralized top-down command structure?
No, I don't think so, because here's the thing. This is where we as economists are somewhat flawed and yet somewhat more able to say something. The somewhat flawed is that we operate within the same framework where we have utility functions and we maximize and we assume that there is a single solution. But we do have models where there's multiple equilibria. And most often, when there's multiple equilibria, there's bound to be which one is the least, like, it's not first best, it's not even second best, but it's between nth best possibilities. And here's the thing, I think that the first best is not available. I don't think that there is, not only that, but
No.
it's super hard to identify. So here's what we have to remove is this kind of, and this first best, it works when we're doing pedagogical aspects to students where we try to explain that trade-offs are there, right? And we make them see that there's a trade-off between two goods, and we keep it simple, intermediate, micro. But in reality, trade-offs are never between two goods. There's many dimensions that we're trading off, over time and over space, and also over different goods. So it's a really complex environment in which we're making trade-offs. There's bound to be suboptimal, but tending to optimality. And in a situation of high uncertainty, I think it's better that we accept the costs of potential risks that you're mentioning for the benefits of not putting all our eggs in one basket, so that once a failure occurs, at least there's some feedback loop that's available and allows for adjustments in policy, so that we at least we acknowledge that it's flawed, but it's better than having all our eggs in one basket. And I find this to be a very sad statement that I'm making, because I'm acknowledging that the world sucks. I too would like a world of unicorns and fairy tales where everybody loves each other. Like, I would love that. I would love that. But the thing is, it's not what economics teaches us. And it's also not how the world works, because economics teaches us how the world works. So I would much prefer an environment that's flexible and has this ability for people to adjust as much as possible. Now, the other thing that really makes it super problematic, and I think I've seen your talk to your students on public choice, and you were hitting it on a nail, is that politicians don't necessarily have incentives that perfectly match on the general interest. And politicians really care about being seen, and being seen is not necessarily the same thing as doing the right thing. So extreme measures that have trade-offs in terms of deeper recession, deeper cost, deeper losses to human flourishing that can be affected, they are not, they might be doing this even though they're hurtful, but it's politically feasible. Let's just think about, like, the things we've discovered that, like, I'm still shocked by this. The US had tariffs on face masks. So you're preventing resources from being reallocated to where they're most needed. Like, if there's places in the world, like, let's be as honest, most African countries don't have a problem right now. Face masks there, if they sell them to Americans, they're going to make a fortune. So by preventing trade between those places, you're preventing the reallocation of resources to where they're most needed. The
So
FDA's monopoly on home test kits.
let me follow up a little bit on that, though. Let me follow up a little bit on that. You could argue also that, I mean, I agree that having a state of autarky is a bad idea. I think
Yep.
every economist would say that's a stupid thing, right? If you
I've
have,
never heard an economist defend autarky.
I don't think anybody defends autarky, but at the same time, if you were to have a very generously free trade regimen, uh, this can lead to over specialization in things like face masks and pharmaceuticals, which is now being almost exclusively produced in China. I think I read something about China producing 97% of antibiotics. Isn't this a problem when you have a shock to a country like China? that is then not able to ramp up production when other countries so desperately need it?
You would have to have super high fixed costs for this to be an issue, and that barriers to entry are gigantic. And I'm not buying that assumption.
No, I don't think it's about fixed cost. My question is rather there's a, if there's a shock of any kind, then you're going to have a problem.
No. But let me rephrase the importance of the fixed cost here, because
Okay.
with barriers to entries means that, let's say the price jumps up 20, 40, 50%. It means that even at price increases of 50%, no one can enter the market. That would mean that there's no ramp up in production. That is a strong assumption. I'm willing to buy that there is some industries that this is the case. But for example, hand sanitizer, this is not a high cost industry. We know, for example, this is something I discovered, pharmacies, so drugstore, sorry. It's pharmacie in French is like the drugstore. So pharmacists do not have the right in the United States and in Canada to mix glycerin with ethylene and make the hand sanitizer. Distilleries are not allowed to do this. They need a special permit in the United States. So think about it this way. We have right now a crisis. There was a pattern in which resources were allocated to non-pandemic activities. We have a shock. We have to adjust at that shock. We have to reallocate resources to pandemic-related activities. The more frictions you put in the process of making that adjustments, the harder that discovery process that I was mentioning earlier will be harder to have, because people can't adjust as easily. There's less flexibility in the system. The more frictions there is, the less this discovery process will be able to work.
With you on that. I am not in disagreement at all that you need to make people able to quickly adjust to changes in their circumstances. But I mean, when you have a pandemic, time is of the essence, right? You can't just equip a factory to quickly roll out pharmaceutical products. So is it really wise to depend so heavily on one country, that is China, for a big bulk of pharmaceutical products? Shouldn't we think, or maybe shouldn't even companies think, okay, if there's a gap in my supply chain, maybe I need to think about alternative scenarios, right? Where would I reallocate resources to? Isn't there a problem in terms of risk management among executives?
So I get some people who worry about the China part, because they have this assumption that China is so large that it can actually dictate institutions in other countries and undermine certain forms of normative settings that we care about. I am not as worried about that as these individuals. And the reason for this is really simple, is dictatorships are actually quite unable to adjust to change. Now, China has been really hard for me to deal with, because there was this old sentence that I call, like, I'm going to divulge my general leaning in life. I'm an economist first, but I'm also an economist who happens to be a classical liberal. And I very much had this Milton Friedman line in my head for years, that wherever you give some form of economic freedom, political freedom is bound to follow in its footsteps eventually. Now, China is making the eventually a very long time period to get to it. So I can't like give an answer that's categorical, but I can say that I'm not worried about relying on China, because I expect that if they tried to exaggerate, it's not hard to manufacture drugs. Manufacture new drugs. It's not really hard to manufacture particular testing kits, as we've seen from when the FDA and the CDC lifted the monopoly that they had on test kits. So we know that at least on some margins, it's possible to increase productions of certain goods. And it means that it's possible for other countries to reproduce this. Now, I would check, for example, I'm willing to bet my skin that if we check tariff rates, so the face masks tariff is specific to China, but I didn't check if there were other tariffs that existed on other countries, let's say India or Australia or some African countries. So
here, I will buy I will just accept for a moment your assumption that China can't change institutions abroad because of its inflexibility as a dictatorship. I actually dispute that, but fair enough. I'll
Uh,
put that to the side.
I find it's a correct thing to dispute, because here there is part of a leap of faith, and part of it, the experiment's not over.
Yeah,
Argument
and
that I would like.
yeah, we don't know yet, but the key thing I would latch onto is not the whether China can change institutions abroad. It's just the fact that it doesn't have to be China. It can be any country. I was reading that a lot of PPE equipment is manufactured in northern Italy. I can't remember where I read that, and it might be wrong, but I mean that's just crazy. Uh, the point is, being flexible to shocks. Can you be flexible to shocks in the face of your main provider of a particular vital equipment like pharmaceuticals or face masks going into a deep recession or having a war, or in this case, having a pandemic? And if that's the case, if you cannot, rely on this sort of Ricardian comparative advantage, which we teach first year economics students, isn't the idea of a perfect free trade sort of a first best choice, as you put it before, but isn't it sort of illusory? Shouldn't we rather aim towards not free trade, but rather being able to be sort of anti-fragile in
Yes,
the face of trade shocks?
I
Yeah.
I really I've been it's anti-fragility has been on my mind a lot. And here's why I like the idea of anti-fragility. I don't like it exactly in the sense that Nassim Taleb argues for it. And here's why, but I do like the concept overall. So, like, the disagreement is probably aesthetical for all intents and purposes, and probably people shouldn't care about the disagreement that I'm raising. But I don't believe that market failures exist, in as much as I believe that there's only failures of markets to exist. As soon as there's transactions cost, you're preventing a market to exist. Transactions cost can come in two forms: natural or institutional. Uh, and there is an entrepreneurial incentive to move and circumvent the both types of transactions costs. But the hardest one to circumvent is the institutionally imposed one. And systems that are able to allow entrepreneurs to discover mechanisms, solutions, ways to adjust production rapidly, to answer arbitrage opportunities, to realize potential comparative gains from comparative advantage that were unrealized before, requires a very flexible system, and that's what generates anti-fragility. Now, the more regulations you put in the way, the more taxes you put in the way, the more barriers you put in the way of people, the more likely you are to have rigid systems that are unable to incorporate new information and learn and discover more information in very uncertain settings like the one we're in now. That's why, like, my main worry right now is mainly look at the line. I do this for a living, and there's a pile of regulations that I'm like, what is like the public, like, let's take like our public economics justifications that we give for some regulations. There is clearly going to be some regulations that are justified in this world. There is clearly some level of public debt that is justified, et cetera, et cetera, right? There's an optimal level of everything, and it's never zero. Now, why is it that we don't allow, for example, in Canada, nurses to cross provincial lines as easily as they could? It's not as if like a nurse in Saskatchewan. Sorry that she's in Saskatchewan, by the way. It's not as if like she's less qualified when she enters Quebec. Maybe like the
I'm
language barrier is an issue.
Saskatchewan. That's my question.
Yeah, it's like, why are you in Saskatchewan? That's like, clearly, it's like, I'm sorry for you, man. Like, actually, you know what? This is why we need to make it more mobile. Like, you need to be able to leave Saskatchewan is the most important thing ever.
Oh, terrible.
Yes, but you want to have systems that are able to allow the reallocation of resources easily.
Yeah.
Tariffs on masks, occupational licensing. Just like take, for example, this is the United States that drives me nuts. Is the main worry is the number of hospital beds that are available. But the United States have these stupid, and I'm really okay with saying fucking stupid. I cuss a lot. My students are always surprised that I tell them I cuss like a crazy drunk Irish sailor. I'm just not drunk when I'm teaching. Just after.
So I want to follow up
But
on that actually, because you know
yes,
what?
but wait, I
Oh,
just want to mention like
sure.
the
Go ahead.
certificate of need laws.
Yeah.
Certificate of needs are incredibly stupid laws in a sense that they are panels by which you must acquire a license or certificate for opening a new hospital, and that license is conferred by a board composed of other hospitals. So it's like saying, hey, I want to be an economist. Other economists tell me if I have the right to teach. It's like
Yeah.
it's there's bound to be some form of incentives that's biased, and most of the papers find that there's maybe like some little gains in quality on some dimensions, but they really always emphasize a large reduction in the quantity of available beds. So think about like the importance of a flexible system. You could more easily allow right new hospitals to open. You could just actually there's some hospitals projects underway just lifting the certificate of need for the duration of the period, fast tracking certain hospitals, these would make for the more flexibility that I've been arguing. In
So can I
Quebec, private
follow
clinics cannot provide, and this is the one that drives me nuts. There's a friend of mine, she's a doctor. I really have to say that one. It's
All
driving me
right.
nuts. She's a doctor, and there's an entire floor of a hospital that's being unused now. This is
Yeah.
unused capacity, and there's an element in the law that says private and public institutions cannot live in the same building. There's a
Yeah.
private clinic that could be right there and increasing capacity and providing some bed. And then just at the worst case, you cannot, without even doing any form of privatization, right? You would just have these private clinics increase capacity temporarily and they'd build the government. Yes, there'd be an increase in expenditure for one period, but you wouldn't leave unused capacity. You'd have people adjust more easily. You would have not only that, but there's also like limits to lending materials between hospitals, and you pile on these regulations. You're like, this is all frictions that make it harder for the discovery process to operate.
So to what extent, thank you. So to what extent, what you say actually frames a lot of this current pandemic as an economic problem in the sense that it's a problem with the allocation of resources.
Yes,
We know,
entirely.
for example,
It's always that.
well, yes, and one of the major issues here is not that it's not just that people are dying from this, and that's a horrible thing, right? 1 in 100 people, I think, die from the coronavirus if they get it, according to estimates. And I've seen various estimates. Some are higher, some are lower.
Yep.
But it is very horrible that people die from this, and it's a horrible death. Uh, Something else that's really horrible about this is the fact that in Italy, at least, and in some places, 1 in 5 people require hospitalization. So now we run up against resource constraints, right? We are told that doctors in Italy, internal medicine physicians, have to turn away people from ventilators and just give them sort of something that allows them to pass away very peacefully, right? Um, and could it be that much of this is driven by this resource constraint that we talk about? We say that you're not able to allocate, say, beds efficiently to fill capacity. In France, I know they're doing this. They're trying to take resources by train from one area of France to another, so that they can reallocate these resources in a way that's timely. Is this a solution? That's number one. To what extent is this an economic problem, as opposed to, and not as opposed to, but in addition to a biological medical problem? In what sense is this an economic problem in addition to a medical problem? And number two, in what sense is this specifically a public choice problem? Which you alluded to already. You've already alluded to the fact.
Oh yeah. Okay. So that's
Problem.
like I'm
Yeah.
I'm looking at the problem you're giving me, and I'm like, it's
Yeah.
like there's so much to swallow, and I'm trying to cut it into pieces that are manageable. But regard to the first part, the resource constraint against which we're hitting ourselves, I think it's easier just to work inside the main models we do as economists. What sets the constraints? Yes, we have income, but we have the prices of both goods. But when we say the prices of both goods, when we draw the budget curve for our students and say, look, this is where you put your optimum, we get that these intercepts based on y divided by price, correct?
Yeah.
But price is actually saying full opportunity cost. The price that I take reflects somebody else's opportunity cost, and it includes all the non-monetary cost inside. We just, for students, we teach it that way. We just say, like, look, the price reflects all costs. But what are regulations? They're extra costs. What
Yes.
are certain distortionary taxes? Not like taxes that change everything by the same proportion, but like excise taxes on the use of ethylene alcohol or glycerin or whatever it is. You're changing the relative prices, which by definition means you're changing the constraint, which means that part of the constraint that people are hitting against themselves now is the result of institutional makeups. Uh, what part of it? It could be that a large part of it is just low income for poor societies. Even if the prices were low for certain types of activities, incomes make it that there's less resources to allocate. But Italy, even though it's not, in my opinion, a really rich country, it is quite poor for a developed economy. And not only that, but the disparities are huge between parts of the country. Uh, it's still not a poor country, and yet what makes it that they're unable to allocate resources like this is it that there is something inside the mechanism, the incentives that politicians face, the constraints that they face, or the lack thereof in certain situations, versus what constrained consumers face and different actors who have more relevant information about what is the closest thing to optimal. So this answers how we would divide constraint. What part of it is just heck, how much resources we have, and the other part is how hard are you making it? How much are you changing the costs of allocating the scarce set of resources to its most valued use? That's the first part. Now, with regard to how much the public choice failure there is, I think, now, this is where my priors, and I'm quite willing to state them, I'm generally very skeptical of the abilities of governments to do things efficiently. I accept a world of highly imperfects, and I'm always willing to do trade-offs of uh, bad institutions versus less bad institutions, and everything is a comparative institutional analysis in the way I see it. But there is, from a normative standpoint, something to make clear is that governments are really, 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 and positive. They're not. They're not benevolent despots. They're really bad. Just the fact that there's this is a piece I've written as a kind of a summary of it for the American Institute for Economic Research. Is politicians like this is the one that always gets cited in the United States is you don't want to be Herbert Hoover, do nothing, right?
Right.
It's the stigma of doing nothing. But sometimes it is correct that doing nothing is the correct thing. I'm not saying that doing nothing is relevant here. So Herbert Hoover was accused of doing nothing in
Yes.
the Great Depression and made things worse by doing nothing. But there's like a ton of paper in economic history showing that a lot of what was done, and actually Hoover did some things, and a lot of what was done by the New Deal probably was counterproductive. And there's massive debates to like
Are you
on net how
suggesting that we should do nothing to fight
no,
coronavirus as a government,
no, no,
or?
no, no, no. That's not what
Oh,
I'm suggesting. But I'm
fair enough.
trying to frame the idea of the bias in actions by just wanting to avoid the stigma, because politicians are utility maximizers like you and I. They maximize their reelection odds, and they also like to be well seen in history books. If you read, why is it that presidents and prime ministers love to write their memoirs? Because they want historians to judge them as nicely as possible. For them, historians are a key constituency. So the act of doing nothing for them comes with different costs and benefit than doing nothing from the general interests perspective. This divorce in this asymmetry between one politician's incentive and those that would match with the general interest creates this public choice problem where it's not correct that the best policy, even though, like I said, we could identify it, that forget arrows and possibility theorem, forget every of the problems that are theoretical problems that matter. Let's just, for the sake of argument now, forget about them. Just because of that disconnect, that asymmetry, we will never identify it. So how much of a big problem this inability to match things, how large is it? it's really large, it means that the larger it is, the more of a public policy failure it is, and the more this is a government failure. And I think we won't know for sure until this is played out in full. Because right now, and this is the best virtue of thing, is we're seeing different countries experiment differently. And once we'll have more data, we'll be able to see what has yielded the best policies. But from a politician's perspective, that best, the closest thing, like the one that asymptotically converged to optimal, right? The closest thing to, is not in their interest to identify, because second order, third order effect, the big trade-offs are not for them to consider. For a politician, if shutting down and a lockdown is politically rewarding, but it comes with suicides that we don't observe, higher opioid consumption, like all these things that come with recessions, right? They're costs. We as economists say, look, we save life on one margin, but we're destroying some on another. Like, it sucks. The world sucks. I
I
would
mean,
love an
yeah, I'm
unconstrained
not
world.
sure I agree with that entirely. I wanted to ask you actually about this. You talk about data. I'm not sure that, in an ideal world, yes, we would have more data and we would be able to figure out which policy solutions across the world, which are heterogeneous solutions. Compare, for example, China, which is perhaps the most draconian, with, say, somewhere like, I guess, Taiwan or Singapore, which is less so. In Singapore, I'm told that the schools are still open, for example. Um, Compare those two countries, and that you see some evidence of different approaches working in different ways. When you have a swiftly moving and very unknown pandemic, though, isn't there an argument for the precautionary principle? This is Nassim Taleb again. I know you aren't partial to him. I'm a bit partial to Taleb and to these ideas, but in the absence of data, you don't want to make the mistake that absence of evidence is evidence of absence, right?
I
And
agree.
yeah,
I, I, let me do a partial defense of Taleb, because there's a lot of things he says that annoys me, and there's a lot he says that I really love. And the thing is that they're widely divergent. It's like clearly like a bimodal distribution. There's like two nods. There's I really love these and I really hate those.
that's why you should really love him as an author, right? He
Yes,
stirs so
I really read him religiously, and I'm always ambivalent because of these extremes. But he is correct, and at least on the anti-fragile part. But I'm not. I'm less convinced on the precautionary principle, largely because of this book. So I piled up the books that like are
Can you
references.
read it for us?
So this is called The Pox of Liberty. It's by economic historian Werner Troskin. He unfortunately died last year. And the subtitle of it is How the American Constitutions Left American Rich Free and Prone to Infection. And in it, there is this, and this will require like a discussion of like the economic history, but there's a lesson from it that matters. He points out that the US was singularly bad at dealing with infectious diseases, especially those that were able to deal with vaccination in the 19th century. So it's a 19th century argument. And the weird part is that the countries that were able to impose vaccination had, in spite of being dramatically poor in the United States, were able to have massively lower deaths from like smallpox in terms of death rates. But the US was incredibly richer. And the argument that Troskin makes is that there was a trade off. The United States was able, the institutions that made Americans sicker also made them richer. And there was this trade off because what limited the ability of governments to mandate, for example, uh, uh, vaccination were property rights justifications. So if there was a Supreme Court that was limiting the ability of governments to violate property rights, it also meant that the governments could not violate property rights and would have faster growth. The places that were more able to do it, governments were less constrained. So they were able to get one good thing and one bad thing. And the other part that Troskin, like, so there's that first trade off, and then there's a time dimension trade off that's relevant. And it's that the US was actually singularly great at dealing with disease of poverty. So typhoid fever, things that would relate like for high capital stuff that would require for like water infrastructure. You need rich high capital society to deal with water diseases, waterborne diseases because you need treatment facilities, and these are capital intensive, and capital is pretty much the domain of rich societies. So he pointed out there was this trade-off not only in terms of infectious versus non-infectious diseases and wealth on one dimension, but there was future gains in healthcare that you and get in health outcomes that you would trade off. And now I know I've made a long-winded point, but it comes down to this: is institutions are bundles. You can't disentangle the bits and pieces, right? There is a particular institutional setting, and it's chosen in a way that comes with costs and benefits. And you can't get the wheat out from the shaft in these situations. You can't unbake a cake, which is why, in this situation, when people are arguing that, precautionary principle would just apply differently to so many places, and then some places could come at such high costs because of the institutional makeup. Maybe precautionary principle is valid in certain settings where the institutions are well geared to dealing with this extreme shock and going, okay, look, imagine we have a very flexible system and resources can be reallocated very well. We have a low public debt environment, et cetera, et cetera. In a situation like that, you could technically just do a complete lockdown and say, everyone stay inside for 3 weeks, and we're going to pay everyone who stays inside and can prove they stayed inside, we'll pay them $10,000 out of public debt, right? A country that has that.
Is there a bit of a false dilemma here? Because I feel like you are right. I mean, in a sense, I mean, as an economist, I can't deny that there's obviously a trade-off from basically stalling the economy or slowing down the economy, causing it to plunge into a recession, versus allowing the virus to proliferate right across the country. So I can't deny that there is that potential trade-off, but I feel like a lot of it is illusory in the sense that half measures which governments have taken are, if anything, going to cost us more in the long run in terms of dealing with the pandemic than otherwise. I was saying, and you know what, to his credit, Nassim Taleb was saying in January, you got to put travel restrictions in, you've got to enforce quarantines, you've got to trace contacts. If governments had taken a very small cost out of their checkbook and done that, we could have maybe contained the virus much better than
coulda, woulda, shoulda. This is the part where, listen, if it was, this is let me channel my inner George Stigler here. If it's so efficient, why didn't anybody do it?
Well, that's the question that we're asking. We're trying to figure out, okay, if governments had done that back in January, then they would have been much better off prepared to deal with it.
You're giving them perfect foresight. And I refuse to give that, because the game is, by definition, as we said earlier, bound to be between second and nth best possibilities. And not only that, we have to discover the one. So when you say a precautionary principle applied globally, it could work in place X, it could work in place Y, it could fail everywhere else.
So I would
this
say
is why I really keep emphasizing the importance of, right now, given the high level of uncertainty, the main lesson, this is the lesson we need. We need the most decentralized decision-making process. And there's a role for centralized institutions like the CDC or Canadian Public Health by generating technical knowledge for people to use, but not command and control.
Health does much good. I think it does more bad than good. But yeah, I would agree with you in that sense. But I think that you might be mischaracterizing the argument. The precautionary principle works in the presence of localism, which I think is something that you would agree with. It's basically you give as much power to the local entity or to the local jurisdiction as you can. And then succeedingly, as you scale up, the power drops at an exponential decay. Yes. So that's the idea.
Principle. I don't think it's we're not saying something that's antagonistic to each other. No. I'm saying that some places could apply it if it's relevant for them, because the trade-offs are not the same everywhere. They're not the same everywhere for everyone. Now, what's the perfect answer? I don't fucking know. Here's the thing. There is no meta expert that can aggregate all this information. There is no one who can do this, because it would require, he doesn't have knowledge of all this divided knowledge. And not only that, there's all these trade-offs that are subjective to individual. They're not objective trade-off. They're subjective to the actors in play. This complexity, this wide fabric that's made of very conflicting pieces of information, you can't do command and control. It may generate some positive result on some dimension. It may also generate bad result on other dimension. On net, will it be a contributor? Will it be a non-contributor? We won't know until the end. What I can tell you for sure is that there is few systems that match in terms of adaptive ability, in terms of anti-fragile, than systems that decentralize the use and dissemination of knowledge than those that are decentralized. This is why I keep emphasizing that right now, those people who claim this mantle of the meta expert, this ability to say, I know, I refuse this. I refuse that like to channel my inner Hayek here. I refuse that pretense of knowledge.
So I like that. I like what you're saying here because just following up on that, I think that's a great point you make. I mean, we right now disagree. I'm more of a centralized person when it comes to dealing with a pandemic, and that's fine. But I'd like to ask you a last question, and last broad question is in terms of the role of experts here, because you're right, there is no meta expert. I was reading, of course, this guy Neil Ferguson, who, as you might know, is a guy from J Idea. He's
Yeah,
from
I think he's been. I think the poor guy has been so attacked for no frickin' fucking reason. I think there were so many cheap shots by journalists on this who do not understand what models are.
So I would agree with you in a sense that I don't want to malign Neil Ferguson in particular. That being the case, though, a lot of epidemiology is built around these susceptible, infectious, recovered, SEIR models. And these models, let's be honest here, and I think a good epidemiologist is honest about it to the public. These models are not deities, they're not gods, and they don't give us very good predictions. They're about in the same class as the models we use in economics, in a sense, right? You're trying to account for so many different factors.
This is where I think I like what you're saying, because people are forgetting the role that models have.
Yeah.
In economics, models are useful to teach intuition.
Yes.
Right? And we say to students, here are a set of true axioms that are logically consistent and valid. Now, it doesn't mean that they're relevant. The applicability of a model depends on the assumptions that are made to make it logically consistent. Now, when I do a model, I'm assuming certain things. If a piece of information is not relevant in that model or is not present, it's making the prediction invalid. Economic theory is the construction of logic statements. Epidemiologists do the same thing. It's just that they're making assumptions about behavior. If behavior changes in a way that they haven't modelized and they can't modelize, they'll make false prediction.
I don't know. I feel like what you're saying is a very academic discussion, and it's fine for us to debate and discuss different models as academics. But let's be honest, policymakers and the general public do not understand these distinctions, right? For them, these are distinctions without a difference. What matters to them is that the J idea model, or the idea model in the case of Canada, is the primary model that's used to guide policy, and there's no competing models, right? That's number one. And number two, quite frankly, if you see an avalanche coming, you don't wait on your calculator to figure out the trajectory of the avalanche. You get out of the way.
Yes, but here's the thing.
These models are great academic exercises, but they're not very useful in practice.
No, I will disagree there. They're useful for us to make reasoning and all else being equal in our brains, to understand the parameters, how they work with each other, and feedback loops. That's the purpose of these models. That's the first thing. The other thing, and this is where I will agree with you, in as much that I don't like rule by experts, because politicians have an incentive to pick the experts they want. And there's also this point that I keep making about meta experts. There's always an expert that will tell me that it's technically feasible to build railways with platinum. Now, it's not it is technologically feasible to do so. It's not economically feasible.
No.
It could be if the price of platinum fell.
Sure,
but
yeah.
these trade-offs are not assessed by one expert in one field. They're not accessed by another in another field, right? I could say, look, the price says this, but it doesn't mean like you don't have these meta experts. And the problem that I have with ruled by experts is that because these meta experts cannot exist, they will never exist, is that you're bound to have this discretion that's bad. And I don't like discretion in political system. I like rules that are clear. This is why, and this is the much maligned paper of Kidlin and Prescott that everybody makes jokes of in macro, but it's actually deeps down to a correct point, is that discretion, if it comes with asymmetric ways of seeing things between the policymaker and the other, is that it's based on trying to fool someone. You're bound to have a negative sum game. Systems that are based on rule are predictable. They're you can adjust around them more easily. You can reinterpret more easily what's happening and adjust to this. And this isn't ruled by expert. This is ruled by, and what I'm saying this is that when you have rules, it's rules by constitutions, by clearly defined sets of constraints and checks and balances. And at the time of the constitutional setting, we're making the trade-offs between the things we cannot produce and the things that we can produce, and which one we value more. This is the thing I'm much more interested in. Rule by expert terrifies me. It doesn't mean that experts have no value. It doesn't mean that experts should not be listened to. It's rule by experts that is terrifying, because I haven't included in my argument
I think
how experts have incentives to lie too. I would love to have all the benefits. If the government dictates what research is interesting, I am bound not to say the government sucks at doing this research, at doing this.
And this is a problem that maligns even democratic governments, right? Yes. That here we're going to frame the particular goal for, let's say, NSERC or SHIRK, and we're going to try and get people to, we're going to try to allocate academic resources according to these particular criteria. The issue I have, I think, with the models that we have in economics and in epidemiology is something Milton Friedman said. With a model, it doesn't have to be realistic. It has to have good predictive power, though. None of these models really have good predictive power. I don't think that DSGE models do. I don't think that the SIR or SEIR models really do either. They do chart some trends very well, but that's all they really do. To what extent can you reconcile Friedman's view of positive economics with that particular observation?
So here's the thing. I argue that predictive power is historical, in the sense that as an economic historian, I have sets of theories on my desk that are all internally valid, and they have predictions. And I have past events that give me information about what happened. And I have data that tells me that. I can do counterfactuals of saying, what would have happened? Like, how big of, like, when the people say, for example, this is going to be an example that may be weird, but the American Revolution was caused by tax revolt. Okay, that means that there must be, you're assuming a model where the elasticity of certain goods is really, 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 really high. Sorry, really low. So it's inelastic, and people can't escape the tax burden, and they're really pissed and poor. Well, okay, this is a consistent model. But there's two things that are problematic in this case. Americans were quite rich, so whatever tax burden was, it's probably over a high denominator. And the other part is, you've admitted that there was a lot of smuggling, so it must be elastic to a certain degree. So to which it's like, so I've been forced by just this predictive power to minimize the importance of a particular theoretical explanation. That is the role of models, is that they allow us to assess the importance of certain events. I apply them to history. But I apply them to history. I am much less comfortable to apply models to predict trends
Yes,
because I
thank you.
have to assume
I agree with you. Yeah.
certain behavioral settings to be fixed. And I am not a real business cycle guy, but I'm not far from being one. And the Lucas critique is the thing that always is in the back of my head. If you give someone, you tell them what indicator you're targeting, they're going to match their behavior to adjust to that indicator that you've said you care about. Hence, it's lost all of its meaning because you've announced this, which is why I keep saying rules should be not only rather than ruled by expert, they should be rules that are abstract in the way they are phrased rather than specific, which is unless the poor guy has been bemoaned in this debate, but Richard Epstein had in the coronavirus because of the way he responded to journalists.
I saw the news.
He's been pilloried for that. But he has a great book that's called "Simple Rules for a Complex World," and the argument in there is really clear: is that if we are to have systems that are, he doesn't say it like that, but his point is that if we have to have systems that are anti-fragile, that are able to adjust to shocks and have this discovery process that I have, and you need a abstract rules that are easy to understand for people's behavior to be relatively constant and relatively, it will be easier to predict, but it will be more anti-fragile because of the abstractiveness of the rule, even though we all agree on the concept that it says thou shalt not kill is a pretty simple fucking rule, right? It doesn't say do not kill with a knife and a gun and a coffee mug and a baseball bat. It's just like just don't kill, right? It's an abstract rule, but it's clear, right? We can interpret around depending on the setting. This is what I keep saying why I'm not comfortable by rule by expert, but at the same time, we should not diss modeling. Models are tools, pedagogical, historical, and sometimes, to a certain degree, they're trying to do predictions for the future. And most of the people who use them have some incentive to filter out which one sucks because they have money on the line, they have skin in the game. And there's some models that keep being used on certain margins because they're relevant to the people who have incentives to figure out whether they're relevant or not. There's an optimum point for everything, and it's never zero. So there's a certain amount of models that we need to use in the everyday world, and it's never going to be zero. Rule by expert may be using too much modeling, which is the point.
Well, yeah, my problem is not with models. I think we all use some model in the back of our brain, even if it's a heuristic model. But my problem is with an over Platonic view of models. You know, this is an idealized world, what we talked about before. You know, economics is not the Garden of Eden. And
No, it sucks.
epidemiology is not the Garden of Eden. We have to do with the fact that we, you know, live in a fallen world, if you like the language of the Catholic Church, right? But we have to deal
I'm
with.
not a Christian.
we, yeah.
I'm not. I'm I'm the farthest thing away from a believer you can ever find. But the point you're making is actually, but is still very true.
Yeah.
One of the great virtue of the Catholic Church is that most of its teaching were quite abstract and had the ability, and like this is maybe like a way to like opening a small parenthesis, but people have dissed the Catholic Church for its anti-science. But in history, actually, if we look at it, the Catholic Church has been just look at a map of the moon. Most of the craters on the moon in those maps are named after Jesuit priests.
Absolutely.
So people don't notice, but for a large share of history, the understanding of the church was that God made the world, and if God made the world, he made laws of natures, and these laws of natures are for us to comprehend. We have to comprehend God, so we have to discover what God actually means. If we see something to be true, and our scripture to conflict with that, our understanding of scripture is flawed. That is probably the most science. It doesn't mean that the church has remained as scientific as it was before, but people keep forgetting that the monasteries were incredible centers of scientific knowledge for a long, long period of time. And I would not want to diss that. Now we've ventured into a different area. Uh, but with that being said, I really want to keep pointing out that models are not bad things. we use them because they allow us to understand mechanics in a pedagogical sense for students. And what it forces us to accept, if you try to push too far, what you'll do is fall into kind of utopia. That there is a model that works. That's not the purpose of model. Model is for teachings and understanding and seeking not narrow, but improvements in our marginal knowledge. That's the goal of a model, not pure prediction and saying always works.
Fair
That is
enough.
not the goal of models, hence my defense of them.
I like
And
it. And on that very philosophical note, we're going to end the interview right there. But before we do, tell us where we can find you. VincentGeloso.com, right? Which
I'll spell out my name.
I'll put a link
Nobody...
in the
Oh,
description. I'll put a link in the description. And you also have a very, very active Twitter.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are interested, I can highly recommend Dr. Geloso's research, because I think, if I may, I'm going to compliment you now. I'm going to end on a compliment.
Love compliments. I just have
I think
don't. My wife is in the next room. If she hears you making compliments to me, she'll know my head is inflating at a really rapidly. So I'll make sure she insults me when I come out, so I deflate just a bit.
Yeah, well, here's a compliment for you. From my perspective, and I've been following your research for a while, you take very simple economic concepts and you apply them to a wide plethora of different phenomena in ways that other people are not able to see. And you do it in a way that's compelling and reasonable and rational. And I think that's a very important contribution. I wish we could have more of that rather than a lot of the technical mumbo jumbo that goes on in economics these days. So that's what I will say about Dr. Geloso's research. That's my compliment.
I'm taking it. I'm taking it and running away with it.
You can start, if for those of you who are not economists, you can start with this paper. I think it's a good paper on the lighthouse. I think it's a fantastic paper.
It's my most non-technical paper, and yet it was the one that required the most technical readings.
Exactly. This is a great paper. So
the light ship in economics.
Yeah, the light ship in economics and public choice, right? In journal Public Choice. All right. So thanks, everybody. And thank you, Vincent, for joining us and giving us your time. That was a very enlightening and stimulating discussion. Cheers.
It was a pleasure. It was really fun.
Thank you. Bye.